Welcome to the Storycraft Cafe. Come in, grab a cup of your favorite beverage, and get ready to join the storytelling conversation. Storycraft Cafe is brought to you by Dabble, the ultimate cloud-based fiction writing software. Here we're going to bring together storytellers from all walks to encourage and empower you to craft your best story. If you're enjoying this podcast and would love to hear maybe one of your favorite writers or a story coach or someone in the writing field that you think would make a great episode, drop me a line at hank.garner, Garner, at dabblewriter.com and tell me who you would like to hear on the podcast. I'll put a link to my email address in the show notes just to cut out any confusion. We'd love to hear from you. Be sure to review this podcast in your favorite podcast app. Drop us 5 stars if you're enjoying it. We'd appreciate it. It helps other people find the show. And we are live here in the Storycraft Cafe. I'm your host, as always, Hank Garner. Today, super excited to welcome back someone that I look forward to getting to catch up with and pick his storytelling brain every year about this time. William Kent Krueger joins us again today. He's got a brand new book that drops next month. It's called The River We Remember, and here's this gorgeous cover, as you can see right there. An amazing book. I'm a huge fan of your Cork O'Connor series, have been for years, and I've, loved talking to you about, new releases in that series. But for the last couple of releases, you've changed direction a little bit. Well, not changed direction, but you're telling other stories besides Cork stories. And we talked last year. We had this. You had this great new release that you did with Audible first, if I remember right. And now we're back with The River We Remember, which takes place in 1958 in your beloved Minnesota that you love to tell stories in. This book absolutely captivated my imagination. You know that you're in for a treat when you get the book in the mail and you sit in your favorite reading chair, and I've got this lamp that's it's just like I like it, and you open the book and then you look up and it's been 3 hours, and you don't know where you've been, but you've been to Minnesota in 1958, and that's all that matters. I absolutely love the book. Welcome back to the show.
It's always good to talk with you, Hank, and especially when you say such nice things about my work.
Well, that's part of my charm to woo you with compliments, and before we get into specifically talking about this book, because the Cork O'Connor series is such a vast, big series, what has kind of drawn your attention lately to looking at other parts of time, other parts of the world, and kind of just expanding your creativity outside that series?
So you're wondering why I write standalones? Yeah, the Cork O'Connor series has been my bread and butter for more than a quarter of a century now, Hank.
Wow.
I love Cork. I love Tamarack County. I love all of the people that populate the novels. But there are other stories I want to write. When you write a popular long-running series, you're constrained a bit. Readers expect a particular kind of story from you. So I like that because I don't have to recreate the wheel every time I sit down to write a Cork O'Connor novel. But I want to do other things. I have other stories to tell. And in some ways, they're larger stories. So the standalones have given me that opportunity. Ordinary Grace was the first one that really I stepped away from the genre in a big way and man, did it find an audience? When I saw how popular that book was, I thought I'll do another one. And then I came up with This Tender Land and now The River We Remember. But as I say, they allow me to talk more deeply about issues and themes that are important to me than very often a Cork O'Connor story will.
Do you find that the established world and the established characters of Cork, does that have natural restraints on the kinds of stories that you can tell? I guess because you can introduce all sorts of outside influences to those existing characters, but there's sort of an established world, an established aesthetic there that kind of what are the restraints when writing an existing character?
Well, you kind of nailed the things there, Hank. It involves readers' expectations. When I write a Cork O'Connor novel, I know exactly what readers are going to expect from me. Cork has to be there. His family has to be a part of the story. Henry Malou's got to be at the heart of things. It's got to be, the Great North Woods has to play a central role. The Ojibwe culture has to be incorporated into the story that I write. So, I know the confines, and for me, always the challenge is to write the story I want to write within those confines. And so far, I haven't had any problem doing that. But there are things outside those confines that I also want to explore, or there are issues that I touch on in the Cork O'Connor series that I want to explore more deeply. And so the length, breadth, width of a standalone allows me to do that.
You have in your last couple of books, I'm trying to think about the others, that standalones, you have gone back in time and written historical stories. What does it free you up to do by getting out of our current time, away from current technology? I can think just off the top of my head several things that would afford you. But when you start thinking outside of right now, what doors does that open up?
Well, you hit on the big one. I don't have to worry about technology. When I write a Cork O'Connor, these stories, I have to think about, okay, what really are the technologies involved in investigations these days? And it's hard to keep up with those. The advances just keep coming. So if I go back in time, the parameters are already set. I don't have to worry about not being aware of new things, but I do have to worry about being aware of old things. So I do a great deal of research when I set my novels in the past to make sure that all the historical, mileposts, signposts are in place and correct. But one of the reasons I like to go back in time is, particularly with Ordinary Grace, or now with The River We Remember, is I'm recalling times that I grew up in, so it's a kind of a nostalgic indulgence for me. But for a book like This Tender Land, which takes place in 1932, before I was born, it allows me to go back and explore that particular time and, in a way, draw comparisons with current day. The issues in This Tender Land are still with us today. The more things change, the more they stay the same.
Right.
But there's also a comfort in visiting the past. At least I find it so as the storyteller. And the response to readers, many of whom have lived through the same times that I've lived through, or with This Tender Land, either are still around and they went through those, or they know the stories their parents or their grandparents told them about the Depression era times. So I just have a lot of fun with those.
Nostalgia can be very strong, and there's especially if it's a time that you remember, or especially times that you vaguely remember. The nostalgia of bringing these things back to your remembrance can really be overwhelming almost. But the challenge to that is to visit nostalgia honestly. And that's one thing that I love what you're doing with The River We Remember is there's such an idyllic setting, such idyllic people. Yet you look honestly at, some of our struggles and our failings and, the darker aspects to our, better human nature, if you will. And those are things that you have never shied away from. But when you're thinking back to a time and, really trying to tap into that nostalgia, what do you do, so that you as the writer can look honestly at a time so that you can report honestly on that time?
I lived through 1958. I was 8 years old, actually, in 1958. And that was long before you were probably even a twinkle in God's eye, Hank. But I remember it well, or enough to elicit this wonderfully nostalgic response to it. But you can't rely on just memory. You can't rely on nostalgia to create an accurate story. So I do, for The River We Remember, I did a great deal of research to make sure that all my historical references were correct. And any of the cultural references I made were correct. The songs, the movies, the books, whatever would have actually been available at that point in time. And as you point out, I create what is in some ways an idyllic small town, the town of Jewell in southern Minnesota, very Midwestern town. I grew up in the Midwest, and so I'm able to invest my love of the Midwest when I create a setting like this. But the 50s was really not as idyllic as we might have imagined it or remember it. We were post-World War II and Korea. We'd come out of two major wars that took a lot of young men away, never to come back, that left a lot of families bereft, left a lot of wounding in this nation that we tend to overlook. It was also a time when, we were still struggling with the prejudices that we struggle with today, the ethnic prejudices. And we tend to forget those. We think of them as the gold, Kennedy came in just after this, and it was the time of Camelot. Well, that's a nice image. It's a nice myth, but the reality is a great deal different. And so I use the town of Jewell, Black Earth County, the people there, to show that what we initially see as idyllic when you dig below the surface has all of the problems, all of the turmoil, all of the chaos, all of the questions that are with us today and have been with us forever. Yeah.
Community can be, It is the fabric of society when people choose to bond together over common, things, whether it be family, whether it be religion, whatever it is that binds a group of people together. That can be a powerfully positive thing, and it can also be exclusionary. You can look at things with two eyes and see the good, which then a lot of times invariably is bad to someone on the outside. When you start thinking about these things that are so intrinsically complicated, how do you you're so great at characters that are empathetic and likable, yet very human and very flawed. How do you create a flawed character that's not just hated by the reader? It's such a precarious position that writers are in to come up with someone that is believable. And we almost like characters sometimes because of their flaws, because they're not Superman. They're not just perfect. They're flawed. Talk a little bit about walking that tightrope between someone that is flawed and does things that bristles against our nature, but makes us want to root for them. Maybe it's because we want them to be better or we see the potential in them.
When I used to teach writing, one of the things that I would say to my class is that a good story isn't about what happens. A good story is about who it happens to. Mm-hmm. So my first order of business really is to offer readers characters that they can embrace as real human beings. And real human beings are flawed. We have heroes, but the heroes are always a little on the tarnished side,
Yeah.
And so when I'm creating somebody who does nothing but sow chaos in the story, I try to give the reader a sense of why that person behaves the way he or she does. I don't believe anybody's born bad. Our experiences, our lives shape us. And so I always try to give the reader an idea of what it was in that life that shaped that character to do these terrible things. I think the characters, when you're talking about, for example, one of the central characters in The River We Remember, Sheriff Brody Dern, you've got a guy who really is always trying to do the right thing. He's never certain that it necessarily is the right thing, but that's what he's setting out to do. And he struggles against all the demons of his past that come to visit him at night and keep him awake. But he really is, he's a good man, a very flawed character. And I think he's kind of representative of all of us. I think all of us, we have that moral compass and we're doing our best to follow it. And sometimes we're not there, but we always want to be there. And so I think that's an easy character to love.
Yeah. When you're first imagining a story like this, what comes first? Do you start thinking about the plot that you're going to unravel with these characters, or is there a character that comes first, or is it a time period and you want to paint a pastiche of this time period? And then, where does that kernel of the story come from?
This story actually came out of Ordinary Grace, that standalone that broke me out to a much larger audience. One of the issues that I touched on in Ordinary Grace was were the men who were like my father. If you remember Ordinary Grace, mm-hmm. the father in the family, Nathan Drum, came back from World War II, a very changed man.
Sure.
And he was very like my father. My father, at 18 years of age, graduated from high school, joined the service, and marched off to fight in Europe. He was just a kid. And he came back several years later, a man deeply wounded in body and in spirit by what he'd experienced there. I realized years later that my father was suffering from PTSD, but, they didn't call it that back then. They called it shell shock or battle fatigue.
Right.
I touched on that issue in Ordinary Grace, but I wanted to explore it more. I knew I wanted to explore it more deeply because my father was so like the fathers of my friends, the men who had come back deeply changed by the horrors that they had witnessed and the horrors that they'd been a part of. And so I wanted to explore that more. And that was really the kernel for The River We Remember. I knew I needed to set it in 50s because that was the time when all of these things still would have been in front of people working with the issues. It was also a time that I had a sense of since I lived through it. And it was out of that desire to explore more deeply how the people who came back from that great wounding managed to heal those that did.
When you're in the very beginning stages of a story like this, do you imagine the entire little town? How do you cast the story with the characters that are needed to to carry the conflict, and do you have an idea of what this town looks like in the beginning, or do you just start writing and let the characters come in as they're needed?
No, I had a specific town in mind. town in southern Minnesota. I'm not going to mention the town because people will go, that's not that town. No, I took that town. I used it. I shaped it to meet the needs of the story. But I had a specific town in mind. And the reason I chose it was it was very like the small towns where I'd spent my adolescence in the Midwest, and with a river that ran through it. So it spoke to me. And with that setting in mind, I began I wanted to create a mystery. So let me backtrack a little bit here.
Okay. Yeah.
There is history to this story. I set out to write it right after I finished Ordinary Grace. I had signed a contract with my publisher for this book and was paid a pretty penny for the manuscript. And I spent 2 years working on it. This manuscript was actually contractually due to my publisher 6 years ago. But when I finished that manuscript after 2 years, it wasn't the story that I'd imagined it would be. I honestly didn't have any idea how to make it that story. And frankly, my heart wasn't in it. So I told my publisher, I'm not giving you this piece. With great fear and trepidation, but they were quite understanding. They said, fine, but you still owe us a companion novel to Ordinary Grace. And that's when I set about writing This Tender Land. But 5 years later, when we're entering the pandemic, I wrote everything I could write. I wrote 2 books for the Cork O'Connor series. I wrote novellas, one of which came out as an audiobook original. And then I didn't have any more stories at the moment to tell. So I reached up to the shelf where I had put that failed manuscript, pulled it down and began to reread it. And as I looked at it this time, it spoke to me in an entirely different way. I have to have a story speak to me in order to do it justice. And this story back then just didn't speak to me. I don't know what happened in all those years, Hank, those 5 or 6 years. I don't know if the story just needed to gestate more, or maybe I needed to grow more as a storyteller. But when I took a look at the manuscript again, I thought, I know how to write this story now. And so I wrote it as it stands. Over the next year, I rewrote the whole manuscript to become The River We Remember.
I thought I'd heard that story, or, pieces of it, that this was a book that you had written a while back and wasn't happy with it and came back to it. And that was actually the next thing I was going to ask you about. So I'm glad you went there. But this is something that a lot of writers can relate to because, in the 1,500 or so author interviews that I've done, the vast majority of people, the book that they break out with is almost never the first book that they had written. A few people have published the first thing that they'd written, but they're a huge minority. Most people have trunk novels or shelf novels or desk drawer novels, whatever we want to call them, things that we've written, they don't work. You put them away and you start on something else. And then for whatever reason, maybe you get better as a writer. Maybe it's just the correct time for the stuff, whatever it is, that third, fourth novel, whatever, breaks out. But rarely do I see where someone revisits one of these failed novels and turns it into a publishable work. Also, on the other hand, there are a few people who write a book and it doesn't get published, and they go back to the drawing board and they work on it and they work on it and they work, and maybe they spend 5 years working on this book, and then it becomes the novel that gets them, published or whatever. And I've never really had a firm grasp on what makes a story not work at one time, but then work at another. It's writing and publishing is a lot of black magic anyway, but that maybe this is just part of it. But when you revisited this novel 5 years later, could you tell a difference in you as the writer, that okay, now I understand what this story is, or what the story needs, or maybe this is something that you channeled 5 years ago and you weren't at the place to appreciate the work. What was it? Can you put your finger on it?
Yeah, I didn't have the narrative voice for the story. I tried it kind of as a first-person narrative originally, and it just didn't work. I struggled. I kept cramming it in, trying to make it fit, and it just wouldn't work that way. Plus, it was bleeding from 1,000 other cuts. And when I put it away, I just thought, okay, mangled this. It'll never work. But when I picked it back up and looked at it, I thought, okay, now I know how to tell this story. Now I know what I want the narrative voice to be. And that really was what gave me the wherewithal to launch back into the rewriting of this story and patch all of those 1,000 bleeding wounds.
So when you do a rewrite on a fully complete novel, even complete, not working, but you've got a beginning, middle, and end. How do you approach the rewriting of a project of this size? Do you literally rewrite the novel from page 1 to page 400 or whatever? Is it a massive edit? What does a rewrite look like on a project this size?
When I looked at it, I realized I had a pretty good story in place. It was the characters, the interactions, and again, particularly the narrative voice that was off. And so it was a great deal of tinkering, going back and making sure that those things that they just didn't ring right. I knew how to create the situation in which that the tone was resonant instead. And a lot of it was character interaction. A lot of it was character backstory. And again, a lot of it was just the voice that was going to tell the story, this comforting, sort of omniscient voice that I decided to use. It was not, I didn't have to go back to square one. Thank you, Lord. Yeah. But I find my heart was in it. This time, I could feel like I cared about this story again.
And that's really the main thing, isn't it?
Absolutely. I hope I never put a book out there that I haven't invested my heart in fully.
Yeah. You are embarking on a lot of publicity for this book. You've got a big book tour and you're going all over the place talking about it. Are you ever surprised when you meet readers face to face and they tell you their interactions with your work and how it affects them and, what they take from a story? Are you ever surprised? And, it's weird to hear other people talk about the thing that you create.
After I've been doing this for more than 25 years now, Hank, so I'm less surprised than I am just filled with gratitude that somehow my work finds a connection with people, particularly with their hearts. People really embrace the work in a personal way. And I just so appreciate that. I think I will never grow tired of hearing people tell me how much my work means to them.
Yeah. And that really is a hallmark of your work, is that people take these stories to heart. They really connect with readers in a deep way. When you had that difficult conversation with your publisher, I'm sure that, the river we remember, the way you had written it was just not working. Did they understand you and your readers enough to understand, well, if this book is not connecting on that level, then it doesn't need to go out?
Yeah, I could have published it, I'm sure, because, hey, I'm William Kent Krueger. But I was disappointed in the piece, and I knew if I was disappointed, it was going to disappoint readers. And if I'm a publisher, why would I want to put a book out there that's going to tarnish the sterling reputation of William Kent Krueger and the publishing house? It just, it made good business sense. Plus, for me, it demonstrated their belief in me. And I actually heard one of the execs at Atria Books talk about how they appreciated that I was willing to take this risk, to do something which followed this, this Tender Land came instead, so that I could do something like this Tender Land instead of simply publishing the manuscript I had finished but didn't believe in.
And this Tender Land was no slouch of a book. I mean, that, it's almost like you had to get that one thing out of your system so that you could then clear the slate and move on. It's,
Hank, you got to write the book that speaks to your heart. And this
right.
Tender Land was the one that was the story I really wanted to write. And I didn't see that until after I put aside my first shot at The River We Remember. I'm a firm believer, and I tell young writers this: don't write what you think is going to be popular, or don't write what you think is going to be hot. Don't write what publisher tells you ought to write, or your agent tells you ought to write. Write what your heart tells you should be writing.
And we are so grateful that you did. The River We Remember will be out in just a few weeks. We're going to put links in the show notes where folks can pre-order it, or go to your local bookstore. Tell them that you want to get this book on pre-order, and have them let you know when it's in stock. Kent, what are you working on now? I know you've got a lot of book publicity coming up, but there's got to be a story that's bubbling up right now.
Well, I'm at work on the next Cork O'Connor story. It'll be out, God willing, in the fall of 2024. It's titled Spirit Crossing.
I know a lot of people will be excited to see a return to Cork. The River We Remember, it is out soon. Go pre-order it today. Let your local bookstore know that you want it. Kent, it's always a pleasure to catch up. Tell folks where they can find you online if they want to dig into all of your back catalog and follow along for new, exciting news.
Sure. Like every author, I have a website, www.williamkentkrueger.com.
Excellent. We'll link that up to make it easier for folks to find you. Kent, thank you so much for taking time to come back on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Hank. You take care.
That's our episode for today. There's so much more to come as we talk to authors about the craft of writing, but also the business of publishing. Be sure to subscribe to the Storycraft Cafe podcast in your favorite podcast app so that you never miss an episode. The Storycraft Cafe is made possible by Dabble. Writing a book is challenging. Your writing tool should not be. Dabble is an easy-to-use online writing tool packed with helpful features that allow beginning novelists and published authors to create amazing stories. Visit us at dabblewriter.com and start your free trial today. Thanks for listening.